first speaker is Dr. Ray Juzaitis, who is well known to many of us here. He's a member of our SCS Chapter. He's a nuclear engineer by trade with more than 40 years of experience in the execution and management of nuclear weapons, non-proliferation, intelligence, etc. He grew up outside of Philadelphia. Are you watching the World Series?
Yes.
Congratulations. He got his bachelor's at Princeton in chemical engineering and master's and PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of Virginia. His career is far too extensive for me to tell you in its totality right now. But many of you remember him as division leader of X Division at Los Alamos National Laboratory, involved in nuclear weapons design, testing, stockpile stewardship. He served as Associate Director for Weapons Physics as well at LANL, and Associate Director for Non-Proliferation, Homeland, and International Security at Livermore National Lab. And after his retirement, he didn't really retire. He became a professor at the Texas A&M University in nuclear engineering. He was president of National Security Technologies in Las Vegas, Nevada, and worked with the National Nuclear Security Administration and the Nevada National Security Site. And he has been a valued member of our chapter. He's spoken to us multiple times, but the world in this arena of just war, nuclear age, is evolving rapidly, frighteningly. So I think it's very timely to have Ray tell us today again about his perspectives on Catholic teaching on just war, nuclear weapons, and what we can learn from actual expert experience on these topics in the world. So Ray, welcome.
Thank you, Chris, for a kind introduction. And I'd like to preface these remarks that this is, I don't want to presume on my depth of knowledge of Catholic theology. We have two fathers in the audience. And, but I might ask dispensation for some of the things that I might criticize the magisterium for in the next few minutes. So I go to confession in Santa Fe. Let me start by saying that I've struggled with this issue through most of my career. As a graduate student, I was really pursuing a God-given passion for understanding the atomic nucleus and the energy derived from it. And my dream was to design nuclear reactors, not nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, the time period that I was looking for a job, President Carter had just zeroed out the breeder program in the United States. There was a lot of anti-nuclear sentiment, and the budgets had been slashed for reactor technology. And so I found myself at Los Alamos looking for a job. And the most interesting job that I found there was the design of nuclear weapons. And right from the start, I had a haunting. The morality of nuclear weapons haunted me in those days. And but where I really got comfortable in my career was in the early 1980s. Many of you, probably most of you here were alive during those days, and there was a huge nuclear freeze movement in the country, and it corresponded with the accession of Ronald Reagan to the presidency of the United States, as well as, more importantly, the possible deployment of a new class of nuclear missiles in Europe. That was, again, the idea was to deploy these weapons as a deterrent to Russian missiles that already had been deployed in that front. But the bishops of the Catholic Church had a major study at that point of the morality of nuclear weapons. And contrary, as you'll hear in my talk to today, the bishops opened up the conversation to professionals and to the whole spectrum of members of the Catholic Church, but for us, most importantly, the scientists involved in nuclear weapons. And Los Alamos in 1983, I see Maury is probably the only one with me, along with me, that was still were part of that team that did an in-depth study of nuclear weapons and morality. And going through that study, I gained a lot of insights that lasted me through my career and settled my hauntedness on the morality of nuclear weapons. And so it goes, and I retired, and recent pronouncements of the church started to bother me again, same as the early 80s, thinking, wow, is what I did right or was it wrong? Where does it stand? So in that context, I present this talk. These are reflections of somebody who was deeply involved in the nuclear weapons technology, but is also a devoted Catholic and would really, as Chris was talking about before, trying to bring both perspectives together, and that's what you'll see in this talk. So I'm hoping that Father Carney later will be able to develop more deeply the Catholic morality issues, but as a matter of, I will cover some of those as I see important to presenting my conclusions. Okay, so my first concern was around 2017, 2018. The Vatican seemed to be on a path to changing its traditional teachings regard to nuclear weapons and deterrence. In 2017, the UN General Assembly had just completed and opened for ratification a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, this treaty, the motive force for it, came from the non-nuclear weapon states in the world who were frustrated with the pace of disarmament that was going on among the nuclear weapon states. And they felt not empowered enough in the body of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a fundamental disarmament treaty, but one that's founded on verification, monitoring, and you've all read in the news the importance of the International Atomic Energy Agency in promoting peaceful nuclear energy across the world. Anyway, the UN General Assembly completed this treaty, and it committed its signatories to develop, not to develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, or even stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices, which is a pretty much proscriptive approach to nuclear weapons as they exist. The treaty had no monitoring or verification or even enforcement provisions. So I call it an aspirational treaty, an aspirational declaration of the non-nuclear weapon states to say, we'd really love it if there weren't any of these nuclear weapons around. And so the treaty was open for ratification, and the 50th ratification, which signaled its entry into force, occurred in October of 2020. And I guess I should say the Holy See was deeply involved in coming to the table on the TPNW. It signed and ratified, I think it was one of the first states to sign and ratify the treaty as a full state member, which behooves the Vatican as a political and entity in the world. They did this in September 2017. The office in the Roman Curia, the dicastery for promoting integral human development, sponsored a major symposium on the perspectives of the world free of nuclear weapons and for integral disarmament in November of 2017. And that gave Pope Francis a venue in which he announced his public condemnation of nuclear deterrence. And you can read this for yourself, but I highlighted the part that I wanted to make a point on, is that the threat of nuclear weapons use in his thinking, as well as their very possession, is to be firmly condemned, for they exist in the service of a mentality of fear, which is true, that affects not only the parties in conflict, but the entire human race. Nuclear weapons create nothing but a false sense of security. So there was a subtle change taking place in the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church on nuclear weapons, which had begun with Pope John XXIII. So one questions after this, is this foundational moral teaching of the Church? And I'm not talking about, what is it that it's not ex cathedra, it's not a formal teaching that we all have to adhere to, is it just a political statement premised on an anti-nuclear zeitgeist? And the zeitgeist is sort of the trend of thinking, mostly driven on an emotional level, that really hit the world in the early 1980s and seems to be going there today, which is sort of contradictory to the world events. It stemmed a lot from revisiting the humanitarian consequences of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima, plus 75 years in 2020. A lot of church leaders, the Pope, our own Archbishop, and many world leaders went to Hiroshima to commemorate that anniversary. And so there was a lot of zeitgeist about how horrible nuclear weapons are and how could we let Hiroshima and Nagasaki happen. But these pronouncements misunderstand the essential nature of nuclear deterrence in today's global security environment. And as Pope Francis did, rejected the notion that deterrence has protected world peace, and ultimately embraces the abolition of nuclear weapons, nothing less, as an essential foundation for collective security. So, but there are political elements in this. As I said, the Pope Francis considered, he made an observation that the non-proliferation treaty regime has really created a class structure. There are two kinds of states, which is true. There are those who have nuclear weapons and those who don't. And, but the non-nuclear weapon states represent fundamentally the third world, as we used to say. The first world being the developed countries, the second world being the communist countries. And the third world was not aligned with Soviet Union or the United States. These countries, the non-nuclear weapon states, you've been following the news on NPT review conferences, have been bemoaning the fact that the nuclear weapon states have not disarmed fast enough. And therefore, nothing less than total disarmament is acceptable now. Obviously on a time scale that doesn't matter. Immediately would be fine. And I found particularly concerning the statement coming from the Vatican on nuclear disarmament time for abolition, which preceded 2017. It is a moral reason that recognizes the deterrence as an obstacle to peace and leads us to seek alternative paths to a peaceful world. So this cascading influence has led to our Santa Fe Archdiocese and a pastoral letter that was issued in January of this year. Archbishop Wester issued a letter entitled "Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a Conversation Toward Nuclear Disarmament." I must say that much more than the Pope's comments, which I had always taken coming from his deep commitment to peace in the light of Christ, this particular pastoral was inundated with political statements and political views. He stated his desire to engage a spiritual conversation, especially in New Mexico, because he sees this as a crucible of the nuclear weapons enterprise, because it contains not only Kirtland Air Force Base, Cannon Air Force Base. Is that in New Mexico? No, yeah. Yeah, and clearly Sandia Lab and Los Alamos Lab. And so he feels a moral duty to speak out against nuclear weapons. And he urges us to practice universal nonviolent love with no justification for warfare and no need for just war theory. There's no excuse. In the course of the document, it mischaracterizes completely nuclear deterrence and disparages U.S. nuclear weapons policy. Close to home, he condemned Los Alamos and Sandia nuclear weapons work and argued strongly for the pacification of the laboratories. If only the laboratories could get $8 billion to spend on physics research, sorry, but not this nuclear weapon stuff. In fact, LANL was viewed in this as a net economic drain on New Mexico, which is hard to believe if it's got an $8 billion budget. He cites demographic statistics as evidence of economic, and this is a quote, economic inequality and institutionalized racism endemic in our country. And the sad thing is, when you perused his references in his bibliography, there was no evidence of any prior discussion with Catholics who are actually involved in nuclear weapons work. But just from the way the language was presented, one could see that there was a lot of influence from the non-nuclear groups around the state that have been pretty prominent, and a lot of the same languages appeared in the pastoral letter. So again, why are such pronouncements so troubling? First of all, they misrepresent the nature of deterrence and don't even give credence to the evolution of U.S. nuclear weapons policy through the years. The statements are sometimes corrupted by political influence of an anti-nuclear ideology or an anti-nuclear zeitgeist, and unfortunately are not substantiated with a deep reflection on traditional church teaching founded on the just war doctrine. In fact, it disparages the just war doctrine. And are not informed through dialogue with Catholic nuclear professionals working in the nuclear field. And again, I refer to the Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response in 1983, which was a national conference of Catholic bishops at the time, seeking information from just such people. And I do make a snide remark, too, that doesn't sound like synodality to me. So let me step back and just lay the foundation for just war theory. The Bible and church tradition clearly condemn the taking of innocent life. There's no question. I give some references here, but we know that, as Catholics, we know that in our souls, that human life is truly sacred because of the unique creative action of God to create every human individual who remains forever in a special relationship with their Creator from birth to death. And the Catechism also links, in this last point, interpersonal violence and war as really a consequence of original sin, which it is. We live in a fallen world. However, at the same time, the imperative of self-defense is also enunciated in church tradition. In the Catholic Catechism, we see words that say legitimate defense is not only a correct response for an individual, but is actually a grave duty for those responsible for others' lives and the common good of the family or the state or and the nation. Yes, I'll leave it at that. And one great reference for the importance, not the importance, but the validation of self-defense is a reference from 1 Maccabees chapter 2. Just to put it in context for those of you who don't know this story. The Maccabees these books, these scriptural writings were written at a time in the 2nd century BC when the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem were fighting the Greek influences that were spreading through their country, and that led to some warfare between the Greek army and the Jewish militia or army. And Mattathias was one of the leaders of the army, and it so happened that they had a war. And unfortunately, the war happened on the Sabbath, and there was a group of the Jews who decided, well, it's a Sabbath, we're not going to take up arms against, this is really not something we should be doing. And unfortunately, the result of that was the Greeks obliterated that group and killed them all. And so this quote is in response to that, when Mattathias and his friends learned about that. And, if we do what our brethren have done and refuse to fight, against the Gentiles for our lives, they will quickly destroy us from the earth. So they made the decision that day, let us fight against every man who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our brethren died in their hiding places. So what the Catholic Church has done is to reconcile these two moral imperatives of prohibition against the taking of innocent life, as well as the right to the legitimacy and even grave responsibility to self-defense by the just war doctrine. And it was done pretty early in church history. Actually, St. Augustine was one of the first to enunciate some of these principles, but the one who really codified it in a way that no one else in his time could ever do was Thomas Aquinas, who basically created a codified just war doctrine based on two sets of principles. One set of principles was jus ad bellum, as it's called, and that is a set of principles that dictate your thinking before you declare war on somebody. And so, a moral stance would be to, number one, have a just cause, and Pope Pius XII in 57 basically said the only just cause you really can do these days is self-defense. Second, it needs to be declared by the proper authority. It had to be, war had to be a last resort after exhausting all chances for negotiation, and it had to be conducted with the right intention. It was basically to promote good or avoid evil and observe moral limits when a defensive war is declared necessary. And this basically outlaws wars of genocide and wars of vengeance. In addition, the second set of principles, jus in bello, the principles elaborate on how a war should be fought. And these are pretty important, particularly when you think about nuclear weapons. They must be fought in a discriminate manner so that the targets of destruction are military targets. Those are legitimate. But do not target civilian populations and the innocent. And the means employed must be proportionate to the ends to be achieved, which means the good that you seek should not be, the evil that you take on should not be worse than the good that you hope to achieve. So those are important, proportionality and discrimination. Now, moving ahead through history, the second set, jus in bello, whereas jus ad bello is still very relevant and important today, and when you go to war, jus in bello has had, is a little harder to, modern technology has overtaken the ability to really clearly discriminate between civilians and military and those fighting. I give you the example, so it's not, we don't fight the same kind of wars they fought in the 13th century. You know, if you take a look at World War II, I mean, there's examples before World War II, the Tokyo bombings in March of 1945 killed hundreds of thousands of people, and it was targeted at the civilian population of Japan as a way to bring the war to conclusion. The good to be achieved there was not to proliferate a war that would result in the invasion of Japan and kill millions of Japanese and probably similar scale of American soldiers. And so that had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. And clearly World War II, even in the European front, the Dresden bombings, the Coventry bombings, the Cologne bombings were also in this manner. And today now we have nuclear weapons, and deterrence is the strategy, or is a justification, or it acts on many planes. Deterrence is used to maintain peace by basically persuading enemies that any attack that they would consider would be met with with a response and an undeniable severity and credibility. And to quote here, the second point I'll quote is, dissuading bad behavior with the threat of significant punishment, a strategy designed to discourage an enemy from attacking by threatening retaliation before such an action occurs. Which sounds like the way we raised our kids, by the way. So I guess it scales to the world of nuclear weapons. Nuclear deterrence remains the bedrock of U.S. national security. And just this week, the Biden administration released, as part of the National Defense Strategy, a nuclear posture review that is quoted here in the bottom box. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the fundamental role of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack on the United States, our allies, and our partners, and the U.S. would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the U.S. or its allies and partners. Now, until today, the popes have never been very comfortable, with the nature of nuclear weapons, owing to their destructive capability. No one will argue that, taken to their extreme, nuclear weapons used in vengeance and in war could lead to the destruction of human civilization. There's no question about that. But deterrence, which we have found a way of dealing with those weapons that may be just an example of our fallen state. Deterrence is tenuously accepted as a middle road, to abolition and to a negotiated reduction of nuclear arms. And Pope John the 23rd, in his encyclical Pacem in Terris in 1963, which followed in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, John the 23rd was very aware of the nuclear danger in the world. And he talked about a process that is in order to get rid of these nasty things, there really needs to be a process that is complete and thorough, and must proceed from inner conviction, and everyone sincerely would cooperate in that, all the countries. And that the true solid peace of nations consists not in the equality of arms, but in mutual trust alone. Now, I would claim that John the 23rd really grasped the fundamental ethical issue here, and stated it pretty clearly. Following that, even in the documents of Vatican II, this is taken from Gaudium et Spes, which is the church in the modern world, the church fathers clearly stated that nuclear weapons compels us to think about war with an entirely new attitude, again, which nobody can argue with. But also recognizes that it doesn't happen overnight, and that since peace must be born of mutual trust between nations and not imposed on them through fear of the available weapons, everyone must labor to put an end at last to the arms race, make a true beginning of disarmament, not unilaterally indeed, but proceeding at an equal pace according to an agreement and backed up by true and workable safeguards. I think even our presidential administrations would agree that that is a statement that we all can live with, and it reaches back to something that we can morally feel inside. But the best articulation, I would say, was Pope St. John Paul II in 1982. Now, Pope St. John Paul II had a visceral understanding of the enemy, in Europe. And he had a clear view of world relations in addition to a deep, passionate faith. He deplored the arms race and called for mutual and progressive verifiable reduction of arms. And he urged that independence, freedom, and legitimate security of each nation be respected. He understood that, war, the only way you can achieve peace is to achieve justice. And justice means respecting the independence, freedom, and legitimate security of each nation. We can see that today in the Ukraine conflict, right in front of us. Because a lot of us don't remember, we do, some of us, the standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the reason we have nuclear weapons in Europe in the first place. But he issued a conditional moral acceptance of deterrence, which I think is also, very acceptable. I wouldn't say acceptable, seems to be the wrong word, but it seems like the right, it seems correct, that deterrence by itself is not an end in itself, because it really is based on fear. It's based on, boy, I'm not going to do something to some guy because he'll really hit me back. A very human, reaction. But deterrence can be a step on the way towards progressive disarmament. And we should never be satisfied with this minimum. And this is something that always hit me through my career too. When you work in an enterprise like the nuclear weapons enterprise, sometimes one can get complacent about things. Nuclear weapons, you don't always go to work every day thinking, oh my God, I'm dealing with Armageddon here. I'm creating the tools of Armageddon. And so it is good to understand that deterrence, even if we justify it, is not, it's just the minimum step. And the only response to the threat of war is negotiation. By the way, if it wasn't for Pope St. John Paul II and President Ronald Reagan, these are the two men in history that brought the Cold War to an end. So what fuels these anti-nuclear zeitgeists, you know, or the zeitgeist and some of the church pronouncements? It is really not understanding that, you know, the way deterrence is embodied, is implemented, and the popular conceptions of nuclear deterrence can't get away from this concept of mutual assured destruction, which is a strategy for the United States employment of nuclear weapons that only was alive in this country for a relatively small period of the Cold War, just a few years, dictated by lots of things, one of which was its analytical tractability. You know, you can almost apply game theory to this standoff between two, you know, hostile countries. The theoretical basis was developed in all its mathematical and philosophical complexity by men like Thomas Schelling and Herman Kahn, who are the big thinkers of deterrence in the Cold War. But in MAD, the nuclear force, and you probably feel that you all probably know this, the nuclear force of one side must be able to survive a first strike by the adversary, and then, in response, successfully annihilate the adversary's homeland. And that means attacking purposely their population centers and industrial centers, and it's usually, these are destroyed in what I would call a spasmodic exchange of nuclear arsenals. Somebody pushes a button, and the other guy pushes a button, and the world goes up in flames. So, it can be accomplished. If you want to do this, it can be accomplished by much smaller number of weapons than we have today. And the weapons don't have to be technologically superior. The weapons have to have low precision, you know, they're low precision because you're going to target wide geographical areas, not precise, the smokestack in somebody's headquarters, and have high explosive yields. So if you have no precision and high yields, you know, attacking population centers is the right way, is in this theory the way to go. Now, interestingly, I mentioned about the tractability, the tractable calculus for bilateral deterrence. When you have two bodies, you know, and you apply game theory. Well, one of the best accountants in our nation's history was Robert McNamara, of course, who was able to actually quantify what it means to destroy something in an assured way. And it was to destroy 30% of the population and 50% of the industry. You know, that's what we have to prepare to do after absorbing an attack from Soviets. Now, I'll claim here pretty confidently that the principles of MAD are really morally indefensible. Number one, the whole principle is not to defend your population because you want to be vulnerable. You know, both sides wants to be vulnerable to that retaliatory strike, but you do protect your retaliatory nuclear forces. You got to make sure that after you absorb the first strike, there's enough nuclear power to completely destroy the other country. Counter-value targeting, that means populations and industries, is preferred over counterforce targeting, which is morally backward. And counterforce targeting means attacking military targets. Because you want to protect these retaliatory forces, but you don't want to protect the population. And damage limitation, like civil defense and ballistic missile defenses, were abandoned because you want to have this artificially enforced vulnerability. Hence, we had the ABM treaty that limited anti-ballistic missiles. But today, nuclear deterrence is looked at in a much more sophisticated manner, but it's stated in a very simple way, again, by Ronald Reagan, who I believe was the first one to say these words, although many have claimed after that, in his 1983 State of the Union message, that a nuclear war cannot be won, therefore must never be never be fought, which means you don't even want to start with the first nuclear attack because you don't know where it will take you. So again, in the 1980s, Michael Novak, I don't know, maybe some of you remember from his television appearances, he's actually a theologian. And he wrote a book called, oh gosh, it escapes me right now. Is that nominative aphasia? I can't remember that. Anyway, he said that the principal argument in deterrence is to break it down into two layers. The primary moral intention of a nuclear deterrent is to never have to use your nuclear weapons by preventing the initiating aggressive nuclear attack in the first place. The idea is success is when nobody fires a nuclear weapon, which seems to be, to me, a very morally upright position or a morally just position. But there is a secondary moral intention and that secondary moral intention supports the primary. It doesn't drive the strategy, but it supports it. And that is, if you want to do the first, you have to maintain a credible political and public will that you will actually use that deterrent force if you are attacked. And how do you judge that? First of all, you have to have transparent government policy making. You have to have, which basically justifies a nuclear stockpile. You have public budgeting and resources for the military nuclear forces. You maintain a research and development establishment as well as a physical production infrastructure. You can make these bombs and you can stockpile them. And you can maintain a credible and protected command and control system. There are probably others. But this indicates to any adversaries that you really mean what you say. Because if you didn't, if the secondary intention was somehow corrupted, the primary intention then will not be credible to an adversary and will just be perceived as brinksmanship by the adversary, inviting it to be tested. So I would argue that my concern with the anti-nuclear zeitgeist and some of the church pronouncements that want to see disarmament happen is that in some way you are corroding the fundamental moral basis for having a deterrent in the first place. Now, nuclear policy has evolved from mutual assured destruction with the composition and size of the stockpile, as well as the geopolitical security environment. As times change, and as technology improves or changes or allows us to develop nuclear weapons, you can adopt more better morally justified policy than mutually assured destruction. The United States, the first way that our policy evolved was the U.S. moved away from exclusive consideration of strategic deterrence, which is us versus the Soviets and protecting the homeland, to a deterrence posture that's called extended deterrence that was also effective on the battlefield and in the European theater, most specifically the NATO alliance. And extended deterrence, which is providing the U.S. nuclear umbrella to these countries, did require a diversification of nuclear weapon types and their yields in order to provide NATO allies with the confidence that, when it comes to happen, that they are attacked, that it is credible, that the U.S. nuclear umbrella is still credible. For example, if you're a German and you're facing this huge Russian onslaught, do you really think the United States, if it only had nuclear weapons that were directed at the Soviet Union primarily, will they really launch a potentially global conflagration, you know, if it's only to protect, to disparage Germans or any Europeans? The credibility of the umbrella means that we will actually use the nuclear weapons, but use them in a way that's more appropriate to the field of battle. And that gave the NATO allies a lot of confidence. With time, the counterforce strategies, as weapons got more sophisticated, their precision and targeting precision was improved, the yields were able to be decreased, and counterforce strategies means attacking the Soviets' military targets would gradually replace the counter-value strategies of targeting policy. And ultimately, the flexible response counterforce strategy embodies the intent to stop the hostilities in a limited theater without escalating to a more devastating destruction on a global scale. The idea there is, even if they attack, at the battlefield or regional level, with a credible lower yield set of nuclear weapons, you can better deter Russians at that level. If deterrence fails, then what you do, the moral thing to do is to seek to end hostilities in the quickest manner possible. So when a lot of the, again, I'll call it the zeitgeist, says that we haven't been doing enough in disarmament, one only needs to take a look at the size of the U.S. nuclear stockpile through the years to indicate that it's simply not true. The statement that, we haven't disarmed quick enough doesn't hold water. For example, we had during the Johnson administration, the maximum number of warheads the United States had, matched clearly by this many on the other side, was 31,000. And today, we're constrained by the New START treaty, we have on the order of 3,750 nuclear weapons, which is if you do your arithmetic, like almost a 90% reduction in the stockpiles. Similarly, those who claim that deterrence hasn't worked in the, at least in the first two nuclear ages, I'll talk about the nuclear ages soon, just needs to take a look at how many people were killed in the world over time, starting with the battles in Europe, the 30 Years' War, back in the, whatever you call 1600 to 1700. This is a chart that shows the percentage of fatalities, both civilian and military, in the war over the designated period in history. And take a look at, once the atom shows up in 1945, from there, between 1950 and 2000, it was only 0.4%. And after 2000, and this is during what we would call the War on Terror, it was less than 0.01%. So clearly, you can argue that this was the teaching of the church that did this. I wouldn't. I would, I hate to say it, it was the nuclear deterrent that did this. Today we are in the nascent stages of the third nuclear age, which is why some of the church statements are so disturbing to us as we take a look at where the world is going. This is broken down. First nuclear age was the bilateral Cold War stand-up between the U.S. and the USSR, Cold War 1945 to 1990. The second nuclear age was around the time, well, it was marked by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and it continues to sort of fuzzy, but around 2020. And during this whole period of time, there was a denuclearization paradigm. I mean, this is when we hoped that the Soviet Union could be brought more into the family of peace-loving nations. It was constrained by START 1 treaty, the Moscow Treaty, and a New START. I won't get into the details of all of these. It was, for us at the lab, nuclear weapons stewardship. They took nuclear testing away, and we really had to grapple with the problem of how to maintain the credibility of the stockpile, but not use nuclear tests to do it. There was a clear focus on non-proliferation and nuclear terrorism, particularly after the post 9/11 attacks, and even a consideration of a world without nuclear weapons, which was a subject of a talk that President Obama gave in Prague. And the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The four horsemen of the apocalypse were Bill Perry, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn. These four men wrote a very influential op-ed in the New York Times, or Washington Post, I think it's the Times, that called for a world without nuclear weapons, in a similar spirit that Obama later took on and said, well, maybe this is the time we should be looking to achieve a world like that. But unfortunately, those days, I have to say, are past. That in the third nuclear age, from 2020 to the present, we see a complete turnaround in the Russian Federation. I call it revanchist because in Putin's mind, he wants to be Catherine the Great, and he wants to return to the glories of the Soviet Union, which has no better example in our lives than the 2022 war of aggression against Ukraine. But he has nuclear weapons that are formidable. And China, who we used to regard as one of those small other nuclear powers on the order of France and Great Britain and the United Kingdom, so a few hundred weapons apiece, they are mounting a very significant, very public expansion of their nuclear capabilities. In 2021, our intelligence agency saw a silo expansion. They were building silos for their land-based ICBMs on the edge of the Gobi Desert in the Xinjiang province. And they were doing a lot of technical work to ensure that their missiles would be MIRVed. Multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles allowed you to mount, up to 10, maybe even 20 warheads on a single nuclear missile, and then they're independently targetable once they get at a certain point in their ballistic trajectory. So, Iran, and oh, by the way, there's always Iran and DPRK, which in one case is demonstrated, in the other case is we see the aspiration of emerging nuclear states with hostile political agendas. Challenges posed by Russia. By the way, I thank Brian Fury for some of the more up-to-date view graphs I had. I haven't been in the business for a while. But the Russians have been executing strategic overflights over Europe and North America at a fairly dizzying frequency. They're planning a new rail-based missile system. They're building new high-yield earth-penetrating nuclear warheads. And they're probably conducting nuclear explosive testing in the sense of supercritical experiments, something that is really not something that we in the United States do. And oh, by the way, they're revisiting their friendship. The Soviet Union or Russia and North Korea had a falling out when the Soviet Union collapsed, but they're getting more and more together now. They're planning joint military drills with North Korea, provisioning North Korean hackers, And you saw what they're doing with Iran and Ukraine.
Great. I think we have about 10 minutes.
Huh?
About
10
10 minutes.
Okay. So the Russians' new nuclear systems, the Satan II is really a derivative or a next generation of the SS-18, which gave us so much of a headache in the Reagan years. This is an ICBM with up to 24 warheads, which can also carry hyperglide vehicles. Let's see, the Zircon hypersonic missile is a cruise missile that goes faster than Mach 5 and is maneuverable, so it can evade defenses. They've been pretty proud of that. We don't know how well it really works, but they talk about it. And then they're even introducing non-strategic nuclear weapons in the sense of intermediate range weapons that we got rid of with Reagan and Gorbachev in the 90s. And they're introducing those again. And so they've been working hard. China's also working hard. They're developing a whole new class of missiles that can be nuclear capable. The three bigger ones there, the DF-31A, 41, and the DF-5, are capable of reaching the United States. And they also, and I must say, the Chinese have a very modern nuclear infrastructure. They don't worry about the ability to make 30 pits in Los Alamos. And they have MIRV road mobile missiles. They're developing new ballistic missile submarines, I want to get done. Third nuclear age marks a reemergence of strategic superpower competition on the world stage. Both China and Russia will challenge the post-World War II liberal international order. Russia has already done it. China has its eyes on Taiwan. It's already, I won't talk about Hong Kong. The simultaneous, so think about this in terms of analytical tractability. Simultaneous deterrence of two nuclear superpowers will be substantially different than the bilateral standoff of two nuclear superpowers that was occurring in the first and second nuclear ages. The trilateral deterrence really escapes analytical tractability. Those of you who are scientifically minded know the difficulty presented to physics and mathematics of the three-body problem, which basically says when you start off, you'll end up in a chaotic system. You can just imagine when you translate that to the political world and look at the interactions among three nuclear superpowers. Now the danger is what happens if China and Russia coordinate actions against the United States? Not only does the United States have to deter against each one separately, but it might have to look at the combined forces of two adversaries. And the apportionment and survivability of U.S. nuclear forces will be quite problematic in that regard. And the possibility of think about this, two simultaneous coordinated regional wars, let's say one in one in Europe and one in East Asia, in different geographical locations, extended deterrence will be challenged as first nuclear use in two theaters. They would need to be deterred simultaneously. So, this discussion, taking it to the moral frame, number one, we still agree that unilateral disarmament is morally repugnant. Arms control, but I will say to some of the detractors of arms control that, did I say something wrong, Father Carmen?
I'm going to take a leap.
That's better than your warning. that arms control and deterrence must be pursued simultaneously, which is exactly what Pope John the 23rd and St. Pope St. John Paul II are saying. And interestingly, arms control without a nuclear deterrent force is a pacifist pipe dream. Deterrence without arms control, in this case, in the third nuclear age, may actually fail because we don't have a firm grip of what happens when you have these three nuclear adversaries. So the probability is higher that deterrence would fail. But in the meantime, modernization of the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile has to continue, and the deterrent dynamically must evolve to maintain credibility in a very problematic global security milieu. You saw a little flavor of what the other countries are doing in terms of advancing the technology of their weapons. But now we have to do this without resuming nuclear testing, for now. And the U.S. production infrastructure, those of you here in Los Alamos know, is frighteningly obsolete. The fact that the United States cannot make the heart of a nuclear weapon anymore, with any degree of capacity, is frightening when you think about what's happening on the world stage. And despite the huge budgets. So deterrence must remain credible at all levels of conflict. Again, a moral imperative that you make sure that it's credible and not one nuclear weapon is fired. Escalation control must be strengthened, and command and control has to be secured and enhanced. And clearly, in a world like this, deterrent nuclear force must trend toward more precision and less collateral damage to civilian populations, and eventually must incorporate active and passive defenses. These are all consistent with just war principles. And my last gripe with some of the church pronouncements is the way they use the words mutual and verifiable arms reductions as an obligatory afterthought, rather than showing people or talking about how complex it is to achieve verifiable and monitorable arms reductions. First of all, even if you can get these countries to the negotiating table today, China shows no interest, and Russia, would you trust them right now? It's hard to believe. But you have to have that to even start negotiating. If we were to go after New START, the verifications are going to be challenging because you will be directly accounting for warheads, not just carrier systems, components and subsystems, which are very difficult to verify unless you're right there on site verifying it. And again, that would demand unprecedented levels of trust. Proceeding to a world without nuclear weapons, the next step will require monitoring and verification effort more challenging, comprehensive, and systematic than has ever been attempted in arms control before. Because you'll be going from bilateral to multilateral negotiations, everybody with their own political agendas, global versus limited geographical regions. You will involve all aspects of nuclear weapon life cycles and actually get into the nuclear fuel cycles of the civilian nuclear energy complex. And the objects of accountability will increase on getting smaller and smaller up to and including weapons usable materials. To verify that somebody's not producing a plutonium atom in their country is pretty hard. So, the Church's magisterium must read the signs of the times, in the spirit of Vatican II, to remain a relevant force for attaining peace in the modern world. The aspirational entreaties, focusing just on their destructive ability, which seems to be the starting point of all these. Oh, it's so horrible, we're going to destroy the world. Don't argue with that, but wishing it won't help get them, wishing it won't be effective in getting rid of them. And the teachings to be relevant to those of us in the business of nuclear weapons, as well as all Catholics and the rest of the world, must be rigorously bound to just war doctrine and Catholic tradition. Just to wake up one day and say, I think they're immoral now, is just simply not credible enough, even from a Catholic perspective. And the magisterium, again going back to the introduction that Chris gave, both at the pontifical and diocesan level, must be willing to consider the perspectives of laity who are personally involved in the practical realities of national security and nuclear weapons work. And again, I went through both Lumen Gentium, which expounds on the importance of the laity as also having a missionary impact on the world of today, as well as Gaudium et Spes, which talks about war. In Gaudium et Spes, this is my final quote: "The Church requires the special help of those who live in the world, are versed in different institutions and specialties, and grasp their innermost significance in the eyes of both believers and unbelievers." And I'll end with a quote from St. John Paul II: "To the extent that efforts at arms reduction and disarmament are not matched by parallel ethical renewal, they are doomed in advance." And the final word is, looking at the world today, more than a little prayer will be required. And I quote Luke here, as you can see. So that's, sorry for almost.
I'd be willing to listen to you and pick your brain all day. We do have a schedule, but let's allow time for one or two questions. Question here in the back.
So my background originally was science and computation, and I was studying philosophy and ethics. And I wanted to say, my husband's a military strategist, so I see two different things here. I see very scary national security issues that are really, really scary. We can't ignore those. And I see the moral issues over here, and there's this right now, a huge gap. And I think I'm interested in security too. I mean, I have 4 kids. I don't want China to bomb us. But it seems like a lot of the arguments are ends justified the means when it comes to deterrence. We have Thomas Aquinas talked about means, ends, and circumstances. And so what we really need is to wrap our heads around, can nuclear bombs be a legitimate means? So we need to think about that question.
Well, sure.
Because a lot of what you're talking about were circumstances, and obviously as human beings we can't ignore circumstances of our well-being. But we need to think about ends justify means arguments can be used for almost anything. So we need to construct like a little bit better of an argument than deterrence, because it's an ethical sleight of hand, it's a moral sleight of hand. Like, we don't want to use nuclear weapons, but we have to be willing to use nuclear weapons. Either they are or they aren't, okay. If we're willing to use nuclear weapons, then that itself is a moral issue that needs, and so there's these different issues which we need to think our way around. Okay. So I completely understand the national security and wanting to be safe. I completely understand that. But from a moral perspective, we actually need to think about, are nuclear weapons in and of themselves legitimate? And with what you're saying with targeted and flexible nuclear weapons, maybe they're getting better. Like maybe we can target. Because one thing I have trouble wrapping my head around is that they can't be proportional. They can't be proportional.
That's right. No, I totally agree with what you're saying, but let me just try to make it very basic. With weapons of this kind, you really have to go back to Ronald Reagan's statement. You never want one to be fired. You never want one to be used in a hostility. So then you have to say, how do I get that done? Because the moral arguments to us are not as binding as the moral arguments to Vladimir Putin. And so we need to So what better than deterrence and the moral argument to look to lower yields and more precision? That's exactly what the U.S. weapons stockpile has been doing over its decades of evolution. And so we are more, not only that, eventually, and I think Ronald Reagan was visionary in this regard, eventually you have to say, why not have defensive systems? You know, get the weapons down to a level where technology can give you anti-ballistic missile capability that is capable of knocking them out of the air. Once you knock them out of the air, they're irrelevant, right? And then we move on to the next weapon of mass destruction. But so it's really, the practical question is, how do I never use it, and hope and pray that arms control can bring them down to certain levels, and evolution of the technology can occur towards more precision, as you said, together, and like I said, it is really difficult. That's why there's so much tension, and I think you'll have to live with it. I think we all have to live with that, and just hope that but I, depending on what side of the bed you get up in the morning, you can say we're better off now, in terms of, except until Putin did what he did, than we were 50 years ago, as far as nuclear weapons, the deterrent goes. Your point about are they effective means, I bet you back in the Middle Ages when they invented the crossbow, somebody was complaining that that's an immoral way of fighting because it doesn't involve hand-to-hand combat, and the catapult, and I think humanity is faced with this. It's part of our fallen state, and I sometimes think about nuclear weapons as God gave us the ability to figure out how to do this. Not that he wanted us to wage nuclear war, but he wanted us to be frightened enough that we try to take real steps to get rid of warfare. But it's going to take, God's time scale is much different than our time scale.
Have you reached out?
I think we will need to see if there's another question, very briefly. Jake?
Do you think the statements that many bishops and priests are making could be changed if the church took the opportunity to teach science in its seminaries? Right now it doesn't do that. And I've been instrumental in trying to get science into the seminary where I was, and the big reason not to do it is that bishops won't send any seminarians to a seminary that teaches science. And until that changes, I think we may find ourselves unable to communicate.
I think I'm going to defer your question to the last speaker of the day, Father Cardinal.
And I would add to seminaries, it also would help to have some would-be priests go to the Pentagon for a while.
On that, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative to ask one final question. And yet, maybe this microphone is in fact dead. In the evolution of U.S. nuclear policy, and maybe our brief stint where maybe we were thinking in terms of MAD, to what the more sophisticated policy you described that it evolved to. In your view, in looking at the history, do you see influence of Catholic or Christian understanding of just war and morality entering the thinking of U.S. policymakers?
I think so. There have been, I have to take it from a personal anecdote, there have been people. There's a gentleman by the name of Keith Payne, who's at the National Institute of Public Policy. I don't think he's Catholic. I don't know. I don't know what his...
He's faithful. He's faithful, but he's not Catholic.
He's faithful, but not Catholic. He has been, I would say, an influential policymaker involved in government in a certain part of his career. And so that's one place where I saw that even moral thinking goes into the development of U.S. policy. So it happens. I just can't tell you how broadly it happens. One thing that I fear is again, complacency. And, once you get in the business, sometimes you forget to bring the moral issues to the table. And Catholics with conscience working in the enterprise are the ones that would be able to do that. And even in small ways. I mean, I guess it would be more directly applicable to those in policymaking areas rather than technology. But Catholics can make a mark. I mean, I worked during the Cold War, and so we were all justified in what we were doing. These days, I don't know. I mean, I think everybody is genuinely interested in deterrence as being the moral solution, but I can't speak on the extent of the influence. But it could be better. I mean, those of us in the business need spiritual reflection as well, and that's where the dialogue should be taking place.
Thank you, Ray, and I think you see what a unique community we have here in Los Alamos to have exactly that kind of influence. Before we'll move into a very brief break. We are running behind schedule, but I mean, as I said, I could listen to this all day. Think about this all day. I'll just take again Chair's prerogative to make one concluding remark, which is, well, whether you need to go to confession is between you and your pastor. My reaction to this is that I think this presentation you gave is a very ideal example of how we practice looking at what we learn from Revelation, the entire magisterium of the church, which, by the way, is 2,000 years of magisterium, not just a few. Respecting the moral principles that we learn through our faith, but which start they're broad. Protect human life and engage in self-defense. I think you just demonstrated how complex and sophisticated it is to live up to those moral obligations in the world that God has put us in here and now. And I think and whether we agree with the particular content or content of particular individual pastoral letters or teachings, I think if they have the effect that they bring us as Catholics into the world to face these moral questions seriously, revisit the conversation, and all together come to a better understanding of how we protect human life and our world ethically, morally, and effectively. Perhaps the Holy Spirit has accomplished His will through these circumstances. So thank you, Ray, again.